A man visits a shelter, and a pit bull starts crying. What happens next will leave you in tears. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon as Jack Thompson made his way down the quiet streets of Millbrook, his footsteps echoing in the early morning stillness. At 65, Jack's weathered face and silver hair told the story of a life well lived, but his eyes held a sadness that seemed to weigh him down with each step. It had been exactly 1 year since Jack had lost his beloved pit bull, Max. The wound was still fresh, the emptiness in his home a constant reminder of the loyal companion who had been by his side for over a decade. As he did every morning, Jack found himself walking the familiar route to Millbrook Animal Shelter, where he had begun volunteering in an attempt to fill the void left by Max's passing. The shelter was a modest building on the outskirts of town, its faded blue paint peeling in places, but to Jack, it had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where he could surround himself with the unconditional love of animals in need. As he approached the entrance, he could already hear the excited barks and meows of the shelter's residents greeting the new day. "Morning, Jack," he called out to Sarah, the young shelter manager, as he stepped inside. Her bright smile faltered slightly as she noticed the extra slump in Jack's shoulders. "Rough day?" Jack attempted a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just one of those mornings, I suppose. Max would have been 12 today." Sarah's expression softened with understanding. She had known Jack since before Max's passing and had witnessed firsthand the deep bond between man and dog. "I'm so sorry, Jack. I know how much you miss him." Jack nodded, clearing his throat against the sudden tightness. "Well, no use dwelling on it. What needs doing today?" As Sarah began outlining the day's tasks, Jack's attention was drawn to a commotion coming from the back of the shelter. The sound of frightened whimpers and stressed barks filled the air. "Oh, no, not again," Sarah sighed. Her face creased with worry. "It's our new arrival. He came in late last night, a pit bull, badly abused. We haven't even been able to get close enough to examine him properly." Jack felt a familiar ache in his chest at the thought of an animal in distress. "Mind if I take a look?" Sarah hesitated. "Be careful, Jack. He's in pretty bad shape and he's terrified of people. We're not sure what he might do." With a determined nod, Jack made his way to the isolation area at the back of the shelter. As he approached the last kennel, the frightened whimpers grew louder. Jack's heart clenched at the sight that greeted him. Huddled in the far corner of the kennel was a large pit bull, his brindle coat dull and matted. Even from a distance, Jack could see the numerous scars crisscrossing the dog's body, telltale signs of a life filled with cruelty and neglect. The dog's eyes, wide with fear, darted frantically around the small space. Jack crouched down slowly, keeping his movements gentle and deliberate. "Hey there, big fella," he said softly. "It's okay. No one's gonna hurt you here." At the sound of Jack's voice, the pit bull's ears pricked up slightly. He turned his head, his gaze locking onto Jack's face. For a moment, everything was still. Then, to Jack's utter astonishment, the dog's entire demeanor changed. The frightened trembling ceased, and the pit's tail, which had been tucked tightly against his body, began to wag hesitantly. As Jack watched in disbelief, the dog let out a soft whine, and tears began to well up in his eyes. "Sarah!" Jack called out, his voice shaken. "Sarah, come quick!" Sarah rushed over, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. The pit bull, who had been unapproachable just moments ago, was now pressing himself against the kennel door, his eyes fixed on Jack with an intensity that was almost unnerving. "I don't believe it," Sarah whispered. It's like he knows you, Jack. Jack's mind was reeling. There was something hauntingly familiar about this dog's eyes, a warmth and intelligence that stirred long-buried memories. With trembling hands, he reached out to unlock the kennel door. "Jack, wait," Sarah protested. "We don't know if he's safe." But her words were cut short as the kennel door swung open. In an instant, the pit bull was out, launching himself at Jack with such force that the old man stumbled backward. Sarah let out a cry of alarm, certain they were about to witness an attack. Instead, they watched in amazement as the dog began covering Jack's face with frantic licks, his entire body wiggling with joy. Jack's arms instinctively wrapped around the dog, holding him close as tears began to stream down his own weathered cheeks. "Max," he whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "Max, is that really you?" The pit bull let out a soft woof in response, nuzzling deeper into Jack's embrace. There was no doubt in Jack's mind now. Somehow, impossibly, his beloved Max had found his way back to him. As Jack cradled the dog he had thought lost forever, his mind raced back to that terrible day a year ago. They had been out for their usual morning walk when Max had spotted a cat darting across the busy street. Before Jack could tighten his grip on the leash, Max had torn free, racing after the cat with single-minded determination. Jack's anguished cry had been drowned out by the screech of tires and a sickening thud. He had rushed to where Max lay motionless on the pavement, gathering his beloved friend in his arms. The driver, a young man barely out of his teens, had been beside himself with remorse. In the chaotic aftermath, as the young driver called for help and curious onlookers gathered, Jack had felt Max's body go limp. Overwhelmed with grief, he hadn't noticed the approaching animal control van or the well-meaning bystanders who suggested Max be taken for emergency treatment. In a daze, Jack had allowed them to take Max's body, too heartbroken to think clearly. It was only later, after the shock had worn off, that Jack realized he had never received confirmation of Max's death. His calls to local veterinary clinics and animal hospitals had turned up nothing. The animal control officer who had taken Max couldn't be located. It was as if Max had simply vanished. Now, as he held this miracle of a dog in his arms, the pieces began to fall into place. Max hadn't died that day. He had been injured, certainly, but alive. Somehow, through a series of terrible mistakes, or perhaps something more sinister, Max had ended up far from home, falling into the hands of those who saw him only as a means to make money through illegal dogfighting. "Oh, Max," Jack murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "What did they do to you, boy? I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Sarah watched the reunion with tears in her eyes, scarcely able to believe what she was witnessing. "Jack," she said gently, "we need to get him checked out by a vet. He's been through a lot." Jack nodded reluctantly, loosening his hold on Max. "Of course you're right, but I'm not leaving his side." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The local veterinarian, Dr. Martinez, arrived to examine Max, marveling at the dog's remarkable change in demeanor. Where before he had been unapproachable, Max now submitted to the examination with patience, drawing strength from Jack's constant presence. "Well, he's definitely been through the ringer," Dr. Martinez said, her face grim as she cataloged Max's various injuries. Old fractures that healed poorly, extensive scarring, signs of malnutrition. But considering what he's been through, he's in remarkably good shape. With proper care and a lot of love, he should make a full recovery. Jack listened intently, his hand never leaving Max's head. He'll get the best care possible. I promise you that." As Dr. Martinez finished her examination, Sarah approached with a concerned expression. "Jack, there's something we need to discuss." Technically, Max is still considered a shelter dog. There's paperwork, procedures. Jack's face fell. The thought of being separated from Max again, even temporarily, was unbearable. But before he could protest, Sarah held up a hand. "But," she continued with a smile, "I think we can make an exception in this case. I'll need you to fill out some forms, but I see no reason why Max can't go home with you today. After all, he's already made it clear where he belongs." The relief that washed over Jack was palpable. "Thank you, Sarah. You have no idea what this means to me." As Jack prepared to take Max home, news of the miraculous reunion spread quickly through the small town of Millbrook. By the time they stepped out of the shelter, a small crowd had gathered, many of them familiar faces who remembered the inseparable pair from their daily walks. Mrs. Henderson, Jack's next-door neighbor, pushed through the crowd with tears in her eyes. "Oh, Jack," she exclaimed, "it really is a miracle. We've all missed seeing you two together." Max, still somewhat overwhelmed by all the attention, pressed closer to Jack's side. Jack smiled down at him reassuringly. "It's okay, boy. These are all friends." The walk home was slow, with Max still weak from his ordeal and Jack unwilling to rush him. Neighbors and well-wishers followed at a respectful distance, the mood joyous yet reverent, as if they were witnessing something truly extraordinary. As they approached Jack's modest home, Max's tail began to wag with increasing enthusiasm. By the time they reached the front porch, he was practically pulling Jack along, eager to be back in the place he had always known as home. Jack fumbled with his keys, his hands shaken with emotion. As the door swung open, Max bounded inside, his excited woofs echoing through the house. Jack followed, his heart swelling as he watched Max reacquaint himself with his old surroundings. For a moment, it was as if the past year had never happened. Max trotted over to his old bed, still in its place by the fireplace, and settled down with a contented sigh. Jack sank into his armchair, overcome by a wave of emotion. "Welcome home, Max," he whispered, his voice thick with tears. "Welcome home." The days that followed were filled with both joy and challenges. Max's physical wounds began to heal under Jack's devoted care, but the emotional scars ran deep. There were nights when Max would wake up whimpering, caught in the grip of some terrible memory. Jack would sit with him, speaking softly and stroking his fur until the trembling subsided. Slowly but surely, Max began to regain his confidence. His playful spirit, which had been buried beneath layers of fear and pain, started to resurface. Jack found himself laughing more than he had in the past year as he watched Max rediscover the simple pleasures of chasing squirrels in the backyard or playing with his favorite squeaky toy. The bond between man and dog, already strong before their separation, grew even deeper. It was as if they both understood how precious their time together was, having experienced the pain of losing each other once before. As Max's story spread, it touched hearts far beyond the borders of Millbrook. Local news stations picked up the tale, and soon national media outlets were calling, eager to share the heartwarming reunion with a wider audience. Jack was initially hesitant about the attention, but Sarah convinced him that their story could make a real difference. "Think about it, Jack," she urged. "Your story could inspire more people to adopt shelter dogs, Especially older ones or breeds that often get overlooked, like pit bulls. Realizing the potential impact, Jack agreed to share their story. He and Max made appearances on local news programs, and their tale was featured in newspapers and online articles. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured into the Millbrook Animal Shelter, and adoption rates soared. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the local community's perception of pit bulls. Max, with his gentle demeanor and obvious devotion to Jack, became a living example of the love and nature of a breed often misunderstood and feared. One afternoon, as Jack and Max enjoyed their daily walk in the park, they were approached by a young couple. The woman seemed nervous, clinging tightly to her husband's arm as they neared. "Excuse me," the man said, "but are you Jack Thompson, the one from the news story about the pit bull?" Jack nodded, smiling warmly. "That's right. This is Max." The woman took a tentative step forward, her eyes fixed on Max. "I've always been afraid of pit bulls," she admitted, "but after seeing your story, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Would it be okay if I pet him?" Jack's heart swelled with pride. "Of course," he said. "Max loves making new friends. Just let him sniff your hand first." Max, sensing the woman's nervousness, was the perfect gentleman. He sat patiently as she extended a trembling hand, his tail wagging gently as her fingers sank into his soft fur. The tension visibly drained from her body. "He's so sweet," she marveled, gaining confidence and scratching behind Max's ears. "I never would have believed it if I hadn't seen it for myself." As the couple walked away, the woman already talking excitedly about visiting the local shelter, Jack felt a profound sense of gratitude. Max's journey, as painful as it had been, was now touching lives and changing perceptions. Months passed, and life settled into a new normal for Jack and Max. Their morning walks became a familiar sight once again in Millbrook, with neighbors and passers-by always stopping to greet them. Max, once so fearful, now reveled in the attention, his tail wagging happily as he greeted old friends and made new ones. On the one-year anniversary of their reunion, Jack decided to do something special. With Sarah's help, he organized a community event at the local park. Part fundraiser for the shelter, part celebration of the incredible bond between humans and animals. The turnout was beyond anything they had anticipated. Families from all over town came out, many bringing their own rescue dogs. There were games, food stands, and educational booths about responsible pet ownership and the importance of adoption. Max was the star of the show, of course. He moved through the crowd with ease, accepting pets and treats with gracious enthusiasm. Jack watched with pride as Max gently played with children and greeted other dogs, showing no signs of his traumatic past. As the sun began to set, Jack stood up to address the gathered crowd. Max sat faithfully by his side, leaning against Jack's leg in a gesture of quiet support. "A year ago," Jack began, his voice carrying across the now quiet park, "I thought I had lost my best friend forever. The pain of that loss was almost unbearable. But fate, or maybe something more, had other plans." He reached down to scratch Max behind the ears, drawing strength from the familiar touch. Max's journey back to me was a difficult one, filled with hardship and cruelty, but it also showed the incredible resilience and forgiving nature of dogs. Despite everything he went through, Max never lost his capacity to love and trust. Jack's eyes scanned the crowd, taking in the moved expressions on the faces before him. "Our story isn't just about a man and his dog reuniting. It's about second chances, about the healing power of love, and about looking beyond appearances and stereotypes. He gestured to the shelter volunteers standing nearby. Every day, there are animals in shelters waiting for their second chance. They may not all have a miraculous story like Max's, but they all have the same capacity for love and loyalty. Whether you adopt, volunteer, or simply spread the word, you have the power to change lives, both animal and human. As Jack finished speaking, spontaneous applause broke out. Max, caught up in the excitement, let out a joyful bark, causing laughter to ripple through the crowd. Jack knelt down, wrapping his arms around Max in a warm embrace. In that moment, surrounded by the love and support of their community, Jack felt a sense of peace wash over him. The pain of the past year, the ache of loss, and the fear of separation began to fade. What remained was a profound gratitude for the second chance he and Max had been given. As the crowd dispersed and the evening shadows lengthened, Jack and Max began their walk home. Their pace was slower now, Max's muzzle showing hints of gray and Jack's steps not as spry as they once were. But the bond between them was stronger than ever, tempered by separation and hardship, and made more precious by the knowledge of how easily it could have been lost forever. Jack looked down at Max, who gazed back up at him with eyes full of trust and adoration. And that exchanged look was a lifetime of love, loyalty, and understanding, a silent promise to make the most of every moment they had left together. As they turned onto their familiar street, the porch light of their home glowing warmly in the distance, Jack felt a sense of contentment settle over him. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, he knew he could face them together with Max.